Welcome to the Dare to Know podcast. I'm your host, Fabian Korer. Today, we are joined by Graham Parks. Graham Parks is Professor Emeritus at the University of Hawai and Professorial Research Fellow in Philosophy at the University of Vienna, Austria. He has been teaching environmental philosophy and Asian and comparative thought for 45 years, beginning at UC Santa Cruz and later at universities in China, Japan, and Europe. He edited books such as Heidegger and Asian Thought, Nietzsche and Asian Thought, Composing the Soul, and translated works such as Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Today, we'll focus on his most recent book, How to Think About the Climate Crisis, a philosophical guide to saner ways of living. I hope you enjoy this episode. Graham, welcome to the Dare to Know podcast.
Well, wonderful to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for being here. So let me just start off by asking you, how did you as a philosopher get pulled into writing, an important book about the climate crisis?
Okay. Actually, I have to go back. There's a simple answer that's also the answer to the question of how I got into philosophy in the first place. And it's massive doses of psychedelics. Because this was the late 60s, I left home, I went to university, and through those, the world appeared totally different to me. Sort of very nature mystical stuff, William Blake, seeing a world in a grain of sand and so on. And I thought, well, this is odd because this seems more real than it's very different from the world I'm used to, and it seems a lot more real somehow, and especially the natural world, of course. And so I had that gave me a feeling for the natural world that I didn't have growing up in Glasgow in a rather big industrial city, and that stayed with me. And then when I went to California in 1970. There was the beginnings of environmental movements and so on. And on the one hand, the natural world was beautiful, was majestic, was wonderful to be on the coast and have the Sierra Nevada and so on, the mountains. But on the other hand, it was also clear even then that it was being destroyed. And being destroyed, and that some people were getting very rich by destroying the natural world. And so that made me think. I got into philosophy because I thought, well, what is reality? What how do we handle this? What's the explanation? And secondly, I realized gradually that in my teaching and in my research, I could be looking into the environmental issues and so on. And then, of course, climate change came along. I think it was in the 80s when James Hansen gave that report to the US Congress. And I had been writing a fair amount about environmental issues then, but I then switched more to climate change. The more it became clear that we weren't doing anything about it globally, the more I thought, well, this is really something that I ought to be trying to help with. So that's the longer answer.
Yeah, no, that's great. And also it looked to me, right, like from sort of your philosophical background, right, that you not just have sort of like, your expertise in Western sort of philosophies, right, but also Eastern philosophies. Like, did that sort of help you engage with this project?
It did very much, actually, yes, because, when I was wondering what was going on in the world when a different reality had been exposed to me, a number of people said, oh, well, philosophy could help, but especially Eastern philosophy. And so that started me looking into Indian and Tibetan Buddhism and so on. And then I spent 7 years in Berkeley as a graduate student, and that was a place where there was every religion known to the human race was represented there. And so there was plenty of opportunity to learn about these philosophies and religions, and also to practice. And I came to realize that the Asian traditions obviously they have a very different view of who we are in the natural world, and that they didn't have Christianity with an idea of, well, which promotes to some extent an idea of the human being superior to other forms of life and therefore in a place to dominate them. And so I thought, well, especially looking at global warming, this is a global problem. It doesn't really make sense to try to think about it in terms of only Western philosophy. So, so that was happened to be another thing that influenced me was seeing different traditions.
And we'll definitely cover that, later in the conversation. But maybe just starting right with the reality of global heating, and that's also where your book starts, right? So maybe you could just, run us through some of that reality, right? Like what's some of the science we should look at, and what are some of the important events that you think would be helpful to sort of cover before we dive into sort of more of the philosophical topics.
Yeah, okay. That is a huge topic, as you say, and I'll try to make it brief. I finished that book at the end of 2019, so the situation was not as grim then as it is now, and so I could say very briefly, I think the most important thing to have happened since then is the IPCC report, that Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, because that came out when I was finishing the book, I think the end of 2019, and quite frankly, it's terrifying. They say that even if we were to drastically, the most optimistic scenario for what we could do, drastically reduce carbon emissions starting tomorrow, then it's still so much, we've already pumped so much CO2 especially into the atmosphere that the temperature will rise, they say, by mid-century to 1.6 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial times. And we're at 1.1 now, 1.1 above pre-industrial times. And if you look back to 2021 or look at the situation today, it was one of the worst years on record for environmental disasters. And so if a rise of 1.1 gives us this, then how bad do we want it to get? And I think it's important to realize that the IPCC is an extraordinarily conservative organization, because hundreds of scientists and then politicians and policymakers have to agree on a document, and so it really gets watered down in the process. And if they're saying it's going to go up to 1.6, even if we more or less stop tomorrow, then of course politicians keep on talking about, we must really try to keep it below 1.5. Well, they obviously haven't read the climate science. So it seems to me the question is, okay, 1.6, that's 50% more, 50% greater rise than we have right now. Now, the effects in complex systems like the Earth systems are not linear, but so there'd be a lot more than 50% worse. But imagine a year like 2021, and imagine it being 50% worse, just as a matter of course. Do we want it to get even worse than that? It's crazy, because after COP26 in Glasgow at the end of last year, well, I wasn't expecting much from it, and of course, very little came of it. But you realize that we're our political leaders are impotent in the face of this problem. Either they don't want to do anything because they're making a lot of money out of not doing anything, or they're unable to in part because of the way the system is set up. But I think of Nietzsche, when he said, in individuals, insanity is relatively rare, but in groups, as soon as you get lots of people together in groups and nations and causes, he said, it's pretty much the rule. And I just think, as a race, we've gone insane. We're being incredibly stupid, and we'll talk more about how we might make it less bad, but. I think the short answer to the reality of global heating right now is that it's real, and it's going to get hotter by 50%, and it's not going to be, I mean, large parts of the planet will become uninhabitable. And so that means the people who live there currently will be moving next door. And we've already got refugee problems. So we've already got climate refugees. That's going to get worse. So the question to people who say, well, we don't need to worry too much is, well, how much worse do you want it to get?
Yeah, certainly. And so maybe then diving into the question, right? Like, how did we get there? And, obviously that's complex reasons, right? But, you start by identifying a specific attitude, right? Maybe to start there, and you term that like the Promethean attitude, right? So what is this attitude, right? And how is that driving this?
Okay, yeah. Because I don't think one finds this in the Eastern traditions, for example. But yes, briefly, I mean, Prometheus stole fire, of course, from the gods in order to help humans, because we weren't really equipped to face the world. Other animals are well equipped. We come into the world as infants, helpless and naked. And so we need clothing, we need shelter. And Prometheus gave us not only fire, which helps us deal with some of those problems, but also in general, the arts of homemaking, of husbandry, of arts, techniques for making life more comfortable for us. And I think that drive, to use technology, to invent more and more technologies in order to make our lives more and more comfortable, or to keep them as comfortable as they are, has got out of hand. And when you look at the myth, well, Zeus was pretty upset at Prometheus for this theft, and his punishment was to be chained to a rock in the Caucasus and have that huge eagle pecking out his liver on a nightly basis, and then on a daily basis, and then during the night it would regenerate in order to be pecked out again. And in those days, the liver was thought to be even more central than the heart. I mean, so this is the very core of our life is being sapped, is being attacked, is being injured, is being damaged. And I read myth in general as not sort of proto-science or literature about how we might be and so on, but Sallustius, a philosopher, said of one myth, but really referring to them all, this never happened, but is always going on. And so that idea that a myth like Prometheus, that if you go too far with these, stolen goods for one thing, and stolen from the gods, with these techniques to make life more comfortable, there could be real consequences, longer term consequences that are by no means pleasant. And so it's that, and just one more thing, we see that drive, I think, in when people tell us to relax and not be too worried about climate change. Very often behind that is, we'll find another technology that will fix things. And this idea of we'll always be able to bring in more technology. Geoengineering is the big one now. And I'm just thinking, oh man, just stop already. And so I think it would really help if we saw that drive at work, if we acknowledged that we have that drive, then we have some distance from it and maybe can, to some extent, tame it. It doesn't mean not using technology, but it means really questioning the technologies we develop.
Mm-hmm. I think that's certainly important and helpful if that would be done more. In your book, you also discuss, several obstructions, right? Like, why are we here? What are some of the challenges? Who are actually, putting forward these obstructions, right? And actually dealing with this crisis. And, talking about sort of the war of ideas, right? Like, obviously we need to have certain ideas to actually tackle these challenges. And here you actually really focus on sort of the libertarian ideology, right? Like how that has played a role in discourse about the climate crisis. So who were some of these founders of libertarian ideology? What type of ideas did they put forward, right? And how have those ideas been used, or some people might say abused? So I would love to hear your take on that.
Yeah. I should make it clear. Yes, the libertarians are the real villains in the story, as far as I'm concerned. But I should make it clear. I mean the right-wing libertarians, because in the beginning there were left-wing libertarians, there were anarchist libertarians, focusing on freedom and having the freedom to do what one wants in the confines of one's own home, and not having the state interfere. And I'm all for that. That's great. But the right-wing libertarianism has its roots actually here in Vienna, not far from here at the university. Friedrich von Hayek was the first person to use the term the battle or the war of ideas. And he said, we really need to get some different ideas. This was in the aftermath of the Second World War. And he wanted, obviously, to counter totalitarianism and too much government control and so on. But then the way that his ideas got taken over through the Mont Pelerin Society, people in the US, economists like James Buchanan, F.A. Harper, then later on Milton Friedman, Alan Greenspan, now I suppose we call that in economics neoliberal rather than libertarian, but that neoliberal strain in economic thinking, freedom from government intervention in two forms. Government taxation we don't want, because that's the government taking my money and using it for causes that I haven't agreed to, using it for purposes that I may find abhorrent. And secondly, government regulation, that the freedom of the free market has to be sacrosanct. And so we mustn't have government interfering with businesses and trying to keep them honest, or trying to keep them from their activities from damaging the rest of us. And it was really, I think, through Ronald Reagan in the Reagan years in the US and Margaret Thatcher in the UK that those ideas became mainstream, became enacted, and they're still very much alive and well today. I mean, if you look at the US or look at the UK, Boris Johnson's cabinet is full of libertarians. It's scary to think. I mean, I hope he won't last long, but whoever might take over could be worse, because that sort of thinking through the Institute of Economic Affairs in London, which was one of the first right-wing libertarian think tanks, is still going strong and advising these people. We've got that thinking. I mean, it's all over the world now, and of course, the major, you think, well, what's wrong with it? Well, the major argument against it is the climate crisis. That if you say, hands off, we're not going to regulate business, it'll all work out in the end, the free market will figure it out. Well, you get the crisis we're in right now. That's the problem.
Certainly. I mean, I think you quote, or you mention yourself, right? Like climate change exposes market failure on the greatest scale the world has ever seen. So I think, that is a pretty huge flaw. And maybe related, right? Like to sort of libertarian thought, or like right-wing libertarian thought. I think here we can also start talking about sort of the Republicans in the US. The US, obviously, being one of the most important players in actually being able to deal with this crisis. And then here you state, and I quote you, the Republican war on science is a holy war. And this is especially true of the war on climate science. So maybe now we can sort of address what are we talking about here, and then maybe also how that actually, again, relates back to, the libertarian or right-wing libertarian ideology.
Right, yeah. I mean, okay, the first two of these three obstructions that I talk about are the political clout because of the financial clout of the fossil fuel industry, and then the political power of the religious right in the US. But not only in the US. I mean, Bolsonaro is a right-wing libertarian in Brazil, and if he manages to sell and burn the rainforest to line his own pockets, we lose what are called the lungs of the earth. So yeah, there's really been this sort of unholy alliance between, again, goes back to Reagan. Reagan was a president who wanted to revive religious America, as his slogan went. And so if you look into the history of it, yeah, there's cooperation with the fossil fuel concerns and with the right-wing evangelicals. Again, it's not Christians in general, it's not evangelicals in general, it's the individualist, hyper-individualist right-wing version that is so powerful in the US. And that has meant that on the one hand, from the fossil fuel industries, enormous amounts of money have flowed into politics and continue to do so all over the world, where that affect policy, that in order to influence policy, in order to shield the fossil fuel industries. And at the same time, you have people like Senator James Inhofe in the US is the most glaring example, but quite a number of his colleagues too in Congress who have this belief that God controls the climate. And if God controls the climate, then nothing we human beings can do will affect it. And so it's a very convenient reading. It's a gross misreading, I think, of Christian theology, but it's a very convenient one because it means that, well, we don't need to do anything. And although they need to, these people have been chairs of key congressional committees on the environment and energy and so on. And they are obliged to listen to climate scientists. That's part of their job. But they say, yeah, we have to listen to them. They come in and they talk. But of course, we don't really pay any attention because nothing that climate scientists say is relevant to the situation if God controls the climate. So again, they're free to have those beliefs, but when they conduct policy on the basis of those beliefs, which involve totally ignoring the science, and some of them are chairs of the science committee, for heaven's sake, then obviously there's something very much wrong. And it could be very easily fixed by having a rule that doesn't sound to me that radical, which would say that if you're going to be on a congressional committee, you have to know something about the area that committee has jurisdiction over. You have to understand it. And these people, by that rule, would be disqualified. So yeah, so that's I think the problem there.
Certainly, I think that would be a reasonable ask, but you are also quick to point out, right, that like this hyper individualism that's sort of situated in the US, but also across the world, I suppose, with regard to sort of this Christian interpretation, right, that is not the main interpretation at play, and especially when we look at religion more broadly, right, many of these religions are actually what you mentioned, community oriented, right, so not as a hyper individualist focus. So maybe as a broad question, right, like how should we look towards religion when we think about the climate crisis? What is the role of religion more broadly?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a good question, because I think the religion has a great role to play, and for the most part, the world religions seem to me to be doing it. Perhaps not stepping up with as much power as they could, but I mean, Christianity, especially if you read the New Testament, it's a religion of love. It's a religion of community, compassion towards one's fellow human beings, and so on. Buddhism, the same way. And the world's religions have, or people have written, scholars especially have written a lot about how the world's religions and religious ideas can contribute to not only tackling the climate crisis, but environmental concerns more broadly. The one exception, I think, is Islam. That doesn't seem to be as much written by scholars of Islam, which is odd, because it's a religion of the book, like Judaism and Christianity, and the Quran is full of the praises of Allah's creation. And that seems to me another key idea, that rather than focusing on that those few passages in Genesis that talk about domination of nature and the human's high place because we're made in the image of God, rather focus on the fact that God found his creation good and very good, and then it got better as the 6 days went by, and therefore, and we're meant to be taking care of that. And if we mess it up and treat it disrespectfully, then we are definitely not in harmony with the teachings. And I think that Pope Francis, that encyclical now a few years back, Laudato Si, is a magnificent document. I mean, he sees it wonderfully. He reads scripture and brings out the passages that really need to be brought out in our current situation. And I was mind blown when I first read that document. It really is something that everyone, I think, should read. It's because it's informed by, he understands the science. He has good advisors on the science, and it's a reading of the scriptures that is totally appropriate to today. It seems to me.
And it was also surprising to me, actually, when I read that work, that he also draws on other traditions, right? Not even just on Christianity. He's even, trying to sort of broaden the spectrum, right? That could be on board with, his message. So that was also surprising to me.
Yes, he certainly is. And what was most surprising to me was his emphasis again and again on the interconnectedness of all things. His namesake, Saint Francis, was good on this, that as human beings, we're related. We're in the same family as trees, streams, animals, the moon. Those are the kind of ideas that I think would be really helpful and totally compatible with most Asian ideas about how the world works.
Yeah, no, certainly. So now maybe this is a good point to sort of move to this interaction between, Eastern philosophies and Western philosophy. So again, like a very small quote from you. So, you state, how to think about the climate crisis necessarily raises the question of how to think about China, right? So how do you think about sort of this dialogue across cultures, across like ideological divide, right? As you mentioned, maybe thinking about political philosophy with regards to democracy, right? How do we, go over those type of boundaries and still have a useful and proper dialogue?
Yeah, that's the big question, because I mean, my interest and in fact in working on the book, I was already invoking Chinese ideas and saying, look, if we just step out of our tradition, the tradition of individualism, the tradition of post-Cartesian ideas of we're separate and different from everything, that I think really got us into the climate crisis, the idea that we can manipulate the natural world as much as we want because it's other than we are. It's just dead molecules in motion, and we are ensouled. We have souls. That of course that gave us lots of wonderful technology, and the Promethean drive went into overdrive because we could just manipulate it as far as we want to make everything more and more comfortable for ourselves. And I think it's a good idea. Again, as I said before, we've got a global problem on our hands. Why try to solve it with the Western ideas only that got us into that problem in the first place? So I was already in the manuscript, which I worked on for years, talking a lot about Chinese philosophy. Then it became clear that without China's full cooperation, we can get rid of those three obstructions that I mentioned. The third, by the way, is the internet, the distractive power of big tech, which tends to distract us from the big problems. But let's say we can get rid of those obstructions or get around them or disable them in some sense. Without China, it's not going to work. As you say, the US is a huge player too, but I think eventually they might be brought round. But without China, it's not going to work. China is just too big an emitter. And then, of course, the question comes up, It's got more acute in the last 10 years, I have to say. But what, you're going to deal with a dictator, Xi Jinping, a tyrant, and oppressor and so on. Well, I mean, if you want to stay on the moral high ground and say we don't negotiate with dictators, well, okay, then we burn the planet. We have no choice. We have to work with the Chinese. And a few years after he came into power, he was quoting a lot more than any of his predecessors classical Chinese philosophy. He was saying socialism with Chinese characteristics has to be set back on our traditions, our ancient and venerable Chinese traditions. And well, of course, you never know, does he really mean it? But it was a very encouraging sign to me. And I thought if he would really follow through on these ideas, Confucian and Taoist ideas that he quoted, which were exactly the ones I've been discussing in my book, I thought, okay, here we have a way in. Because the reason, I mean, China gets more and more difficult to deal with, it's not all their fault. There are ways that we can engage the Chinese on human rights by going through their Confucian ideas, which got into the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There was a Chinese Confucian philosopher who was a big player in that. And we could start with those ideas that are in that document to say, okay, now we've got common ground because they're about the rights of the human family and so on, and they stress community and the society and so on. So we can have that conversation with the Chinese. We have to have it, but please, we have to stop being so arrogant and saying, look, we alone in the West had the scientific revolution. Chinese science was very advanced, sometimes more advanced than Western science, but it didn't connect with technology the way that Western science did. And then, of course, we had the Enlightenment that followed the scientific revolution. And so we know how to reason our way all the way up to the ascent to truth, and the truth, the way, the life. And you Chinese didn't have that. So you have to listen to us because we've got it down. We've got these universal ideas of the good and the beautiful and so on. Well, of course, the Chinese think these are just Western ideas. And so we really need to have a bit of intellectual humility, it seems to me, and appreciate. I mean, one can appreciate and respect the ideas, the philosophical ideas, especially from the Chinese tradition, without having to respect the regime that has been advocating them and the actions of the regime, which have become more and more aggressive and repressive in the last 5 to 10 years. We can make that separation, and I think if we were to show even an awareness of their tradition, it would help. But if we were to say, actually, these ideas from your tradition are much more apposite and apt to our current situation, I think they would open up in ways that could amaze us.
Yeah, so maybe like going with this openness, right? And sort of evaluating like what type of ideas and notions are we talking about. So earlier in the conversation, you already mentioned the notion interconnectedness, right? That played an important role. And maybe to try to get a grasp on that notion, right? You also talk about what sort of the primary unit in society, right? And obviously, again, like sort of, the Western philosophy here takes the individual to be the primary unit, but you stress or highlight, right, that, in Eastern philosophy, the family could be regarded as fundamental, right? So again, here it's like, how do we sort of evaluate that difference, right? And then secondly, how does that evaluation help us reevaluate the notion of interconnectedness that might help us, with climate challenges?
Yes, right. Okay. I mean, I think to start at an even broader level than the family, from the Chinese perspective, our Western idea, especially our idea about politics and society, that what you have is individuals, sort of atomic individuals, separate, autonomous individuals, separate from each other, independent of almost everything, and that they somehow come together in a social contract and agree, we'll will give up certain freedoms for the benefit of security that the state will provide. And so this is Hobbes, this is Locke, this is Rousseau, and so on. Now, from the Chinese perspective, that's completely backwards. That ontologically, as far as what there is and what's primary, they start at the other end and say what's primary, where we need to start, is the interconnected whole that is the world. Because we are, after all of us, in a world or the world. And we're appreciating more and more after globalization, which has brought us some benefits, but also a lot of real problems, that it is interconnected. And so the Chinese say, that's where you start, because that's what's basic. The individual, they would say, is an abstraction, for, something, a concept, a thought. It's not really real. It's an abstraction from the flux of interconnected experience. And so they would focus on the family by saying, okay, me as an individual, who am I? Well, I come into the world related to a biological father and mother, or even if I'm adopted, I have an adopted family, and I am the son of those of those parents. And when I get older, if I have a family of my own, I'm the parent of these different children, and so on. And so, who I am depends on this network of interrelations, which are social, political, and so on. It's all sort of layered, and it all is in the context of the natural world as well, because that's the only way we function. As long as we're on the earth, that's how we function. So when the Chinese say, okay, the smallest manageable unit that it's sensible to discuss is the family, and that's interesting because they see, as Plato did, incidentally, they see the individual as multiple, as a configuration of desires and drives and so on and so forth. But the family, you see it concretely writ large, because you have two parents usually, and children and grandparents and grandchildren and so on. And so what's helpful about the family is that relations there are based on love. I mean, I'm talking about the functional family, not the dysfunctional family of which we see so many these days. But when a family is working well, I think I gave the example. If my daughter is in trouble, I help her. I help her because she's my daughter, not because I've gone through some calculus morally about, well, what's the ethical thing to do, or what does a good father do, or whatever. And the Chinese have I think, a good way of thinking about society when they say, well, just extend that love that you naturally feel for your closest, for your nearest and dearest, out to farther relatives more distant, and eventually to the society and to your to the human family. In some sense, there is a human family. And in fact, the Chinese word for the nation is country family. It's the family that's as large as the country. And so, of course, there are downsides to it. There's nepotism and so on. But if you can extend that feeling that obtains between members of the well-functioning family to others, it seems a very sensible way to go about things. And it's, if you say, okay, well, wait, no, the individual works just fine, well, try solitary confinement for a few years. It's pretty hard. I think Aristotle was right when he said, the human being is a social animal and also a political animal, that we don't really function so well. We're not fully human unless we're in relationship with others.
And so one thought that comes to mind is also when you think, so I always wonder with this type of question, right? Like, in what sense do you have to take something as fundamental? In what sense can you be sort of like pluralist, where you say, well, my identity consists of, me being an individual. Then we can even say, well, even that is sort of pluralistic because, there's different parts of my psyche that, wants different things, right? in what sense is that a viable like approach? Do you think that there's sort of this synergy that can happen that can be sort of a coherent philosophy as such?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's an important issue, because I think that that the when we don't think about it too much, the man or woman in the street, still in the Western street at least, still has this Cartesian idea that we are basically individuals. That's what's most real, and we can work out from there. But if you think about it, if you think, as I say, unless of course there's a small percentage of the population are monks, hermits, people who thrive on being alone. And I mean, I think it's also important to be alone and to be able to be alone. That's part of being human as well. But if you think of, well, how do we understand that on the biological, physiological level? Well, of course, we're not autonomous and independent. We are constantly exchanging the air in our lungs with the air outside, the moisture outside, the water outside, and the moisture of the body, and taking in nutriments and so on. That we are, as bodies, again, we are multiple. The body has so many different functions that work quite aside from the single I that I might think might control them. It's just as well I don't have to control the secretions from the pancreas and so on. I'd be dead within minutes if I had to do that consciously. But the body is related then intimately to nature, has evolved, unless you deny the theory of evolution, has evolved over hundreds of thousands of years in the natural environment, in the environment of the natural world, and is completely interdependent with it, not independent of it, but interdependent with it. And this brings us to the insanity of we're destroying, because we haven't mentioned biodiversity and all the things in the natural world we're destroying the very basis on which the natural resources on which we depend for our very survival. And again, we seem not to be too concerned about that. But I think that if people do reflect on it and just question that, because it's very seductive, that idea of I'm a mind, because if I have an armchair and I lay back and I engage in some abstract thinking, I can feel as if I don't have a body. This is another thing, the Cartesians among the rich billionaires who are ruining the earth, and I think planning to leave it, these colonies they're going to have on the moon and Mars and so on. Can you imagine life on Mars? What kind of a life would that be? The human body, I don't think, thrives. They've seen that with these space, when they send people into space for a long time. It's pretty hard on the body. But this idea that we are just minds is very seductive. And I think that it's a very important thing to try to get people to just reflect on that. Think about that. Is that really what's going on? Because then that opens us more to feeling of, oh gosh, the natural world here, we had better take better care of it, because it's the basis of our lives.
Yeah, and I think maybe to add a point to that, right? Like this technological drive, like one other illustration that people sometimes mention has to do with like uploading one's mind, through sort of like, the technologies like AI, and, that's just, a further example, I suppose, of what you already mentioned.
Yes, right, because apparently these billionaires are really keen on that they're going to be the magnificent contents of their brains are going to be uploaded to someplace in the cloud somewhere, and their bodies cryogenically frozen, and my God, they'll be with us forever. But this is another thing, is that I think it goes with interconnectedness. That when you look at Buddhism and Taoism and especially the Chinese tradition, the finitude, the impermanence of everything is central. And when it comes to my impermanence, that's not such a great, it's not such a great thing. I would rather not be a little more permanent. And I think that's a big thing, that we've managed to shunt our demise, our death off into the corner. We simply don't see it much in society anymore. And that this sort of, because the individual and it's interesting that part of that goes back to in the Christian tradition, the soul individuates you and it's immortal. And so that's what we'd like to have, or some people would. I wouldn't. But yeah, I think that's something that again, to reflect on our impermanence isn't a gruesome thing or morbid or whatever. It's getting a sense of reality, and if you get it right, then it's something to celebrate. There's a source of joy there to be found.
Yeah, certainly. And so maybe shifting topic a little bit. So I've actually been reading also about and having a class about like the canon of Western philosophy. And one of the things that get mentioned there is also that, certain topics such as the philosophy of education have not really been part of this canon. And that made me sort of think about something that you discuss, right? Which I think has to do with sort of philosophy of education, which is namely, how do we raise political leaders sort of to be, good leaders, right? And what type of curriculum, what type of education would be required in order to make that happen, right? And I think in general, many people would say our political leaders have failed to deal with this type of crisis, right? So the education question seems to be of great importance and of great urgency. So here you compare like Confucian and Platonic political philosophy. And I think this is a question maybe that's not asked enough, namely, how do we raise good political leaders, and how is that grounded into a specific philosophy? So yeah, maybe you could help us there.
Right. Well, I'll try. Yes, and I think that the question of education in general, and people do talk about, we have to educate our children environmentally and to sort of understand where they are, is an important one. And I think that when you look at Confucius and Plato on educating the people you would like to be in charge of the polity, then it's not just them. I mean, that would be an education for the good human being as well. And yeah, what interests me is, I mean, there are so many parallels between Confucian political philosophy and the philosophy we find in Plato's Republic. And one of them is the education of the leaders, because how are we going to get these leaders to be the most competent? They've got to understand the situation, and the most competent to govern, and also the most virtuous in the sense of being selfless, governing for the sake of the governed rather than for their own sake. And I mean, this you can see that. I mean, Donald Trump was the anti-philosopher king. He was the total opposite of that, governing only for his own benefit and the benefit of his family. But how do you do that? Because obviously it's good if the people in charge are thinking of the well-being of the whole polity rather than just a small section of it. Now, what's remarkable is that Confucius and Plato have similar ideas about how the education should work. It should really be twofold, they say. In the Republic, it's gymnastics in order to strengthen the body and develop virtues like courage and so on, and music. They have to be listening to the right kind of music, and music then included, in both cases, included poetry. And for the Confucians, the two most important arts are music, and corresponding to gymnastics is what we might call ritual propriety. That is, how you behave towards your fellow human beings came primarily from in ritual situations, but also extend that out to generally the mores that govern a society and how we comport ourselves, and it's grounded for the Confucians in the body, in training the body in to move in certain ways. And so it's a little less energetic or spectacular than the Platonic gymnastics. But it's interesting that it's a training of the body, and I noticed that in the US there was a phase where they had physical education programs in schools, but they were too expensive, so they phased those out. So you lost that side of it. How much music is taught in the schools these days? In the US, not very much, I don't think. And what's interesting to me is also that neither of them is saying you've got to educate the leaders in statecraft. You know, they have to know politics and so on. The idea is much deeper and broader. You have to educate them to be real human beings, the best human beings that they can be, and that extends out into through the training of the body in the context of the natural world, and the music, because there's a sort of, in both cases, there's a rather, some people might dismiss it as mystical philosophy behind it, but there's an idea that the music is everywhere, that there's something about the world, the universe, that's musical, and that it's somehow works on vibrations or tones or something, not ones that we hear. And so the idea is that the ruler would be, through education in music and physical activity, would be in harmony as a person, as a body, with the body of the universe, with the body of the world. And that's something that after Plato we pretty much lost in the Western tradition of political philosophy, and I think it was a major loss. The Chinese never lost it, and it's the idea that any governing, that any political leadership takes place within the larger context of the powers of heaven and earth, within the larger context of the physical universe. Because if you look at Western political philosophy after the ancient Greeks, that's not really, it's as if society or the polity were encapsulated and were sort of, again, independent of other things. Whereas started with the emperor having to, in China, having to perform the right rituals according to the time of year and how the harvesting or the agriculture was going, that the Chinese never lost the notion that the political leadership has to take into account the largest context of the natural world. And if that had been the case in the West, again, I think we wouldn't be in the situation that we're in with the climate emergency, that we lost that notion of the broader picture. So it's a rather, I mean, that would have to be fleshed out quite a bit more, but it's a rather strange and interesting answer to the question of how should we educate the leaders, it seems to me.
Yeah, and I think maybe, one big topic within education, and I guess, for the last few decades, right, has been really also about specialization. And in some sense, this bringing up, good political leaders seems to be, for me, a cry against this type of specialization and really returning much more to the broader sense of being human. So maybe that's, relating, I guess, this trend with what you just mentioned.
Right. I think it is because I don't know, why do you have to be a lawyer in order to be the president of the US? It seems like you have to be, what does that have to do with it? Well, I can see what it has to do with it, but you're right, it's too specialized. And I think it's interesting that this hangs together with the question of the demise of the liberal education. I'm old enough to have undergone an education where people were proud to say, the teachers, okay, you're learning Latin and Greek. What use is that in your life? Well, not really very much, but that's the point. You're learning how to learn. It's not that you're learning any particular content or stuff. And it seems to me nowadays, when jobs disappear, whole professions sort of aren't there next week because of technological innovation, seems to be more and more important not to educate people in specific skills, but rather, if you have universities, have them educate people to be citizens and to be human beings rather, and who know how to learn something if they had to learn something different, and who have a somewhat broader view than the specialization that's the bane of so much of life today.
And maybe returning again to sort of the question of like political identities, and especially how we want to carve that out, because already a few times I think you referred right to this idea of, being part of like the broader world, even if we think about, let's say the polis or like a nation from sort of a political entity perspective, and still maybe driving this idea and trying to understand it, right? Because to many people, it might sound strange that, when sort of the Confucian political philosophy says that the whole world is the ultimate political entity, like people might say, well, do we have to think about, a world government, or what does that mean? So like what does that really mean?
Yeah, right. I mean, that goes back to the point where I said that, the Chinese would say we had it backwards, that they're not starting in the right place. And it's, I'm not going to be able to say much that's convincing on this, I'm afraid, because it's a really big issue. But this, let me take a concrete example. And I think because the idea, I mean, the Chinese call it 天下, all under heaven and all under the heavens. And what that means is the physical universe, culture, history, institutions, everything, all under the heaven. Just to make a stab at it, look at where we are with the United Nations. There have been now 26 of those, and I've followed them all. I'm old enough to have been there. Been there on the sidelines. I followed them all. 26 years, annual meetings of the UN to discuss the climate and what are we going to do about it. COP26 in Glasgow, the end of last year. Another resounding failure. Basically every time, what do we get from it? Politicians saying, we understand there's a problem. Let's talk about it some more. Let's meet again next year. We'll talk some more. It's clearly not working. And I think a major reason it's not working is structural or systemic, because when you have, since this idea, the Westphalian notion of how interstate relations work and so on, that conditions today and how the United Nations understand themselves, that just as we individuals might come together optimally and form a social group and a society and a polity, well, nation states operate the same way. That, like individuals, they're separate, they're autonomous, they're independent, and of course they're not, but that's the fantasy. And they come together in the United Nations on a yearly basis and say, how are we going to tackle this problem? And of course, they're all looking out for their own interests, for their national interests. And but if individualism is an abstraction, and if individualism doesn't really work very well, I'm not talking about the truth value of these philosophies. I'm talking about the pragmatic effects of them. And if individualism has brought us to the state we're in now, I think there's something about it that's not working very well. And basically, the United Nations are 197, however many there are, individual nation states coming together and trying to agree on something where, as in the social contract, they would have to give up certain things. They would have to give up certain freedoms or certain advantages in order for the sake of the common good. And I wonder, is there a way, rather than a world government, to have a subcommittee? Because we don't have time I don't think we have time to form a world government, but we could have some sort of subcommittee in the UN on dealing with climate that would come together, that would see it the other way around and say, look, we're all in this together. We're on planet Earth. The planet is burning. How do we fix this? How can we negotiate together, not with the primary thing being my nation state, has to come out of this the best, but rather how can we talk with the idea of aiming for the common good or avoiding the common disaster, because unless we can do something about this soon, it's going to be we won't even have nations to be united anymore. So yeah, sorry, that's not, I haven't had the opportunity to think enough about this, but that would be a concrete way of trying to turn our perspective around a bit.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's definitely helpful. And maybe one last question I have that just came up in my mind has to do with like when you take, so this is sort of going back to the idea of individualism, right? And seeing if there's a way out where that could be reshaped. So I'm here now thinking about sort of a cosmopolitan angle, right? Where you say, well, individualism as cosmopolitanism, like, do you think that is strong enough, or does that still make, certain mistakes, or is that difficult to translate still in sort of a international relations diplomacy setting? I'm not sure if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's not my area of expertise, but there's certainly a great deal about cosmopolitanism that or what do they call it now? The need for a rooted cosmopolitanism, that would help in many respects. But I think that raises the issue of that we haven't discussed, that of course we have to think globally, as the slogan goes, and act locally. There's it goes along with the Nietzsche quote that I mentioned about insanity. There's a much neglected thinker from Vienna here, Leopold Kohr, who warned against the dangers of gigantism, of things getting too big. In fact, he was a friend, an influence on Schumacher, the man who wrote Small is Beautiful, which is still a wonderful book, full of wisdom and very appropriate to today. That I think it's encouraging to me that because of the supply chain problems that we're seeing right now and have seen over the last year, since the pandemic started, that people are rethinking that aspect of globalization. And I think the US is even passing some legislation that would shift the way things work there, and that so many. It would help so much if we could think and act locally while thinking globally, but make things more localized, make politics more localized and community oriented. And basically, Kohr said, well, human beings are okay, but as soon as you get too many of them together, then all kinds of problems happen. And so things are much more manageable, I think. I think democracy works, democratic decision-making works far better at the local level. Even the Chinese have that in some form. And so thinking locally more, especially with food production. We haven't talked about that, but one of the big things is the global food system and its dependence on cycling nutrients through animals before they get to our stomachs. Incredibly wasteful and making a huge contribution to greenhouse gases. But it's insane to have much of your food, maybe some of it is okay, but much come from halfway around the world. And we haven't mentioned colonialism either, but a lot of it is, many of our problems here with the climate go back, of course, to colonialism and imperialism, where the Western powers said, the European powers said, no, you're not going to grow your own food anymore. You're going to grow rubber trees, and we'll bring you some food every now and again. But that destruction of cultures and their food has enormous repercussions. So I think these are areas in which thinking, acting more and localizing things and getting a sense of place, it is, I think, the way to go to improve things.
And now thinking about a big topic, like the good life, right? And then especially like what does a good human life sort of consist in? And here, and that's part of your book where you talk about living according to nature, right? That sentence, right? What are we to make of such statements today, right? Many people might say that. Some people have raised skepticism about trying to create these dichotomies between, for example, culture and nature, right? So there's a lot there, but how do you think we can best explore the meaning of this sentence, living according to nature?
Yeah. I think it still is helpful. I understand people are constantly saying to me, because I would like to, I'm such a fan of the natural world. Well, we got to the end of nature, or there is no nature. It's all a social construct, and so on. And of course, that book by Bill McKibben from several decades ago, he was talking about the end of nature, meaning that there's human-made pollution everywhere on the planet, right at the peak of Everest to the bottom of the deepest oceans. And now, of course, we've gone global with plastics and microplastics and so on. So yeah, we've lost it in that sense. And yes, of course, nature, our view of the natural world is almost always, I wouldn't say always, but almost always informed, conditioned by our society, our culture, and so on. But I think the key difference, or rather the key distinction, if we say, well, nature as opposed to what? Well, how about nature as opposed to artifice? Nature, the Promethean idea again, the natural as opposed to the synthetic. That's a big one for me. I mean, I think that there was a huge change after the Second World War, where American companies were promoting, what was it? Better living through chemicals, or was the slogan? And they started producing synthetic materials that had never been found in the natural world before. I mean, that's a distinction we understand, and we can verify that it's the case through paleoclimatology and so on, that we've introduced things into the world that were never there before the 20th century. And in many cases, in many respects, it's not helping very much. I mean, plastics is the prime example there. So if we think of, okay, follow the way of nature, well, what does that mean? Well, both for the Stoics and for the Taoists, and to a lesser extent the Buddhists, it means, well, try to find you ask pertinently, what does it mean in the present day? Try to find something like a relatively untrashed natural ecosystem. Really hard to do these days, but if you are lucky enough to find something like that, they would say, and look at how things work there. Everything is interconnected. There is no such thing as waste, because what looks like waste is actually food for something else in some different part of the food web. That nature doesn't, in the natural world, I'm thinking of the way that the Taoists talk about water, that there's a lot to be learned from the way water works and plays, that it flows. It doesn't contend with obstructions, but rather flows around them. There are, I think, many things, since we are, after all, still to some extent natural beings, especially when you think of our bodies, even though we might have prosthetics and so on. But that there have been studies that show what is intuitively rather obvious, that the human body, being a natural entity, tends to thrive better in a natural setting. I'm thinking of the Japanese interest in what they call forest bathing, that they're actually, and they found the chemical components that one gets from trees, and that exercising, walking around in forests is a lot better for the immune system than working out at the gym. So if we look at the distinction between natural things and synthetic things. And I know there's a big industry sort of built around all natural ingredients in whatever you buy. And you look at the labels sometimes, some of the names of those ingredients go on for like 4 or 5 lines. You think, is that really natural? And of course, there's a lot of hype there, but it does seem that to follow the natural way, to sort of keep on that side of things and not overdo our intake of synthetic substances, or our clothing ourselves in synthetic substances, that there is still a sense in which we can look at the natural world, the way it works. Natural sciences are understanding it better and better. It's still many mysteries, but we kind of getting a hang of how things work, and that to integrate our activities. So maybe more than just following the way of nature, or taking nature as a model, to somehow see ourselves as integrating our activities with the activities of everything else that's going on in ecosystems. And the Taoists and the Buddhists say there's a way to do that that enhances the whole system. That we thrive from it, but also we can improve the system. And so that's how, and I think that when people say, okay, we never experience nature as it is, but always through societally developed lenses and so on. If you think of the artist who sits in front of a tree or a flower hour after hour, day after day, I think of Cézanne and his mountains and his rocks and his trees. After a while, they appear differently. I don't think Cézanne is giving us the French 19th century version of the rock, but rather he's getting more to what it is. That there is a sense that if one holds back from engagement, you have to have the luxury to do that. You have to have a bit of spare time. I think there's a way also to experience the natural world in more as it is, and less as we project our needs and desires onto it.
One thing that doesn't get discussed in the book, but that just comes to mind now, has to do with sort of a Nietzschean take, where you think about how do we justify life? We justify it aesthetically through beauty. Do you think, because you have a quote of Nietzsche, and let me just briefly read it. The world is overfull with beautiful things, but nonetheless poor, very poor, in beautiful moments and revelations of these things, right? So I'm not sure, like, do you think that sort of this Nietzschean take, I'm not sure if you actually agree with what I'm saying about Nietzsche, but like, do you agree with, like, sort of, how do we justify life aesthetically through beauty, that links together with some of the discussions that we had?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, that book is a mere shadow of itself, the tip of the iceberg, because I had to cut it almost by half in order to get it published. And one of the readers said, too much Nietzsche and too much Marx. So I had to take out most of the Nietzsche and Marx that was in it. But yeah, I'm a huge fan of Nietzsche's. And yes, I think that this is something. I mean, it relates to, I think that quote is from some part of the book where I'm railing against consumerism, because obviously a big part of what has to be done, we're not going to not going to tackle this emergency adequately unless we reduce our consumption. And that's the sort of latest iteration of this libertarian individualist idea of who we are, that we're individuals who are autonomous and so on, and ultimately we're consumers. That's the good life, to consume, and to consume conspicuously, and to consume more and more and more. And it's just not going to work. I mean, a small proportion of the world has taken that to extremes, the rich countries, or the overdeveloped countries, as I think they need to be called. It's a small proportion, but we have trashed the planet doing that. And of course, there are many hundreds of millions of Chinese who would like to, and Indians and Brazilians and so on, who would like to rise to that level of consumption and be as comfortable as we are or have been. But that simply won't work. The laws of thermodynamics don't allow it. So we have to reduce our consumption. And when I bring that topic up, especially with younger people, students in China as well, people say, oh, what, really? We're going to be miserable. I mean, we're going to have to consume less energy and fewer consumer goods. We'll have less stuff. And my response is, well, on the one hand, I think you're going to have to. I think we'll be forced to. I don't think it'll be a choice, but we might as well choose to do it beforehand, because if we try, we might find that we're actually not so miserable as people fear, and we might even feel more fulfilled with less stuff. Certainly, that's the wisdom of the ancients, of the ancient religions, of the ancient philosophers, and so on. And so, this idea of the ascetic justification of existence, I think, is very much connected with that, because if we get rid of all this stuff that's cluttering up our lives, well, we're going to be able to experience the world a little more directly, see a bit more of it, because we don't have all this stuff in the way. And I think that if we give ourselves that opportunity, we find that, as Nietzsche said, that the world is full of beautiful things that go unappreciated, that we hardly ever even notice. And so that would be part of why I think that a life at a lower level of consumption would be more fulfilling, is that we're simply, I mean, of course, not just Nietzsche, people like thinkers like Emerson and Thoreau in the US are great on this issue too, that there is a great satisfaction to be found in just being in having done your work and then being able to just be. And you say, okay, well, I live in the middle of a big city here in Vienna, but there are parks. I mean, we can go to a park and sit on a bench or on the grass. The problem with that is, of course, that I don't pay for it. The city pays for it. I pay for it through taxes. But nobody gets rich through people looking at birds or sunsets or whatever, except the airlines. I mean, we didn't talk about travel, air travel, but yeah, I think there was just that had to be taken out of the book, but that's an important aspect that I think needs to be factored into to what we have to do, because it counters this myth that so many people share, that lower levels of consumption will make us miserable.
And relatedly to this idea of beauty, one might also start talking about an idea of the sacred, right? Like where we're talking about a specific form of beauty that, we maybe should reserve for this idea of the sacred, right? And here you first of all sort of highlight, right, how that might go against sort of certain economic thinking, right, where it's all about use, it's all about utility, right, where we're just not going to get to a notion of like the sacred. And you also invoke a story, right, by Zhuangzi, and I like this, right, where you highlight, and I quote here, the usefulness of being useless, right? So maybe you could sort of tackle, right, like, why do we need a notion of the sacred, and how does it relate to this usefulness of being useless?
Yeah, I mean, I think we still to a large extent have a notion of the sacred. I mean, I think one of Nietzsche was pretty critical of certain forms of Christianity, but he wasn't critical of religion. And in fact, at some level, I think he's a religious thinker. So I think, and people are, religions are massively important to the majority of people probably on the planet. So I think we have, and these notions will, these religions will have a notion of the sacred. So I don't think we're in danger of losing that. Of course, it tends to get shunted aside. But yes, I think what that Zhuangzi story is interesting because there was a sacred grove and a tree that had grown to enormous size because it hadn't been cut down. And I think if we see how the notion of the sacred so easily gets eclipsed by our pursuing utility, again, it's connected with the Promethean drive. But as long as we see the world through the perspective of utility, the more we see it through that perspective and only that perspective, the more we miss, because of course the perspective of utility, of course, it's necessary. We have to make a living. We have to function in society. We have to get through the day and so on. But to me, it's an incredibly important thing to acknowledge that that's only one perspective, valid in its place, but that there are many other ways of looking at the world. And that Zhuangzi story shows that this tree was regarded as sacred, had to be protected. Yeah, people would have got rich, would have been more comfortable if they chopped it down and used it for firewood or furniture or whatever. But no, we're going to preserve that there. And you find this a lot goes back to what we were saying about the contribution of religions, that many religions all over the world or adherents have said, no, we need to keep this grove of trees or this river or this spring or whatever unharmed, untrashed. It's because it's sacrosanct. And so it's connected with us. You're never going to be able to have a sense of the sacred if you're always driven by the perspective of utility. And so again, people say, okay, it's a luxury if you're working 18 hours a day in order to just keep your head above water. It's a luxury you don't have. But many of us do, and I see these push in many places for the 4-hour work. 4 hour. That's a bit optimistic. The 4-day work week it would make sense. I mean, the American idea that you live in order to work is still taken hold a lot of places, but I think in Europe we still hang on a little more to the idea that we work in order to live, and if we can then limit the amount of work we have to do, we can do some living as well, and that living would that then frees us to see things differently, to see our surroundings differently, to see the whole situation differently. And again, as I said, I think that brings with it a fulfillment that is important, and that is important for the advocates of consumerism to pretend is not there. It's because they're not going to be able to monetize it. So yeah.
Some people might also argue, right, like when we talk about consumerism, that it's also sort of this relationship that we develop to things, right, where we put certain things, on a pedestal, and like that's what we should be striving towards, and it's gathering more things and growing our inventory of things, right? And then this also refers back to what I think you already mentioned a few times, right? Sort of like the Cartesian moment or the Cartesian philosophy, right, that has, I think what you claim, right, constituted sort of this dysfunctional relationship with things, right? And in some places you say, right, like that the Cartesian sort of desouled the world, right? Like, we have the soul, but nothing else but us. So maybe you could just comment, right, in what sense do you think that this Cartesian sort of element, right, is so deeply ingrained in sort of the Western philosophy, right?
Yeah, it really took hold, and I think this is an important issue because, of course, it's easy to focus on things of nature and how we tend to disrespect them, trash them, destroy them, and so on, ultimately to our own detriment. But yes, I think we do have a deeply dysfunctional relationship to things like this, coffee cups and garlic presses and all kinds of things. Because we regard them as inanimate. And this is the remarkable thing about the Cartesian ideology, is that the idea that the world is lifeless apart from human beings, or let's say we're more generous than the Cartesians and say we'll include animals and even plants, let's say life, but then there's beyond that, there's the lifeless, the inanimate. That's a crazy idea. It's a parochial idea. It's restricted to Northern Europe, and it's really recent, only since the 17th century. And most people in most epochs of human history would look at that idea and say, what on earth are people thinking of? Because the world appears to them as naturally ensouled, as naturally full of spirits or naturally full of energy. And you think, well, that's just animism, that's primitive animism. And we've gone beyond that. Well, animism is, I don't know if it's in the book or not, but it was an anthropologist called Tyler who coined the term in the 1870s, I think, to talk about savages and primitives who see spirits in the running brooks and in the trees and so on. And so they must be projecting the contents of their Cartesian minds onto lifeless matter. Well, you only need a notion like animism if you're already a Cartesian. It's only in the Cartesian framework that you need to talk about projection. Of course, there's lots of projection going on. I mean, I think all the time, everything's a matter of projection. But if we can step back from our Cartesianism, and in part, again, it's part of stepping back from or getting out from under the perspective of utility, then we see things as we could, I use the term, I borrow it from the Zen tradition, from Dogen, befriending things that we can because they're not so different from us. We're related, especially if human beings made them, or if we ourselves made them. And I think if we were to retract that projection of utility onto the world and see things differently as possible companions in life, some of which are more impermanent than we are. Most of my favorite clothes have worn out. I wore them so much, I can't wear them anymore. But others of them, probably, I don't know about this cup, but others of them my garlic press definitely will outlast me. And so these they're like human companions we're in it together. We're all ultimately impermanent, but some of them will last longer than others. That idea, I think, would really enriches our experience, and I think it reduces loneliness because and the other thing would be, I mean, if you can befriend the things around you, how many of them do you need? Well, even before the era of Facebook, I was always intrigued in America to find out how many friends people have. Dozens, hundreds. I only have about. I mean, how much time can you spend with each of them? And now on Facebook, of course, you can have way more than that. But I think really good friends, they're fewer and further between. And so, again, cutting back on consumerism, reducing the number of things that we need to have a fulfilling life, we're better able to relate to them and to befriend them. And that really, I think, certainly in my own case, that's enhanced my existence no end.
I think that's a great example, actually, like how, friendship, right? Like there are people I think the intuition would actually be, right? Like, no, having a few good friends is actually much better than having hundreds where you can't build that relationship. So I think it's a great example to illustrate, right? Like how this sort of expression of friendship, right, can maybe change the mindset that people have. So no, that's a great example. And so, I mean, we've been talking about loads of like philosophical ideas, right, and how they relate to the climate crisis, how we can reshape, rethink some of these perspectives, get more dialogue flowing between different philosophies. But in the last part of your book, right, you ask a bunch of like urgent questions again, right? So, you raise, what do we do now, geophysically, socially, politically, economically, and in the context of climate justice. So again, this is obviously like, a huge amount of important questions, but, what's sort of your general take, right? What should we take away when thinking about those things from your perspective, and also in the context of what we've been discussing?
Yes. Oh gosh, yes. It is huge, and I felt an obligation to. I mean, I'm not an expert, but yeah, to try to have a stab at saying, so what could we be doing? What can we do to make things less bad? Clearly, geophysically, we've got to reduce carbon emissions, and change land use is another thing. And, there's enough science. We know what it is that we have to do. It's just that many people, especially if they have ties to the fossil fuel industries, are determined not to do that. But it's clear that that's the most urgent task: reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And as I say, we mentioned food earlier, that reforming the food system and moving to more plant-based diets be better for our health. But we're not going to even have a health if we burn the planet. So yeah, I think it's clear that there's going to have to be some pretty big changes take place geophysically. What else? Socially, I mean, that's connected with social changes. And it's wonderful to see that among younger people, vegans eating vegan is. I mean, I remember I've been a vegetarian for decades when it was almost impossible. It was a very difficult thing to be able to survive and enjoy eating if you didn't want to eat meat. But that's clearly this is a social change that's taking place that I think will really help. Things like SUVs. I mean, I imagine a world in which owning an SUV, the sales of those damn things are going up and up and up. A larger proportion of cars. It's absolutely insane. And they are gratuitously harming the rest of us who don't have SUVs, pedestrians and just regular citizens. So that's something with, and I think that probably among most of the younger generation, owning and driving an SUV is becoming less and less cool. But yeah, it's an obscenity that people can flaunt their disregard. I mean, either they're really ignorant and stupid, or they're so self-absorbed as to be mean, nasty to the rest of us. Politically, get the money out of politics. That's the simple answer, and it's doable. You can have state-funded elections where you don't allow any outside money to come into it, and turn off all these spigots of corrupting cash that's flowing into and distorting policy making. Economics is my area of least expertise, but I see there's things like donut economics, and there are many economist people who've been writing about the Green New Deal and various possibilities for that. The inequality since the pandemic began. I mean, apparently the 10 richest people have become twice as rich, and so on. I mean, it just gets worse and worse. There are ways of fixing that. Wealth taxes, all that money that disappears offshore is meant to be in the trillions. It would be a real help if we stop that. But of course, the problem is that these libertarian billionaires have bought the political system. I mean, globally, and they're remaking it to suit their own ends, and they're being fantastically successful at it. But surely there's a way that the other us 99.99% can, I mean, we have the numbers at least. We ought to be able to do something about this. And what was the last thing? Oh, justice. Yeah, the global justice thing. Because I mean, this, and I wonder if this is, I mean, rather than trying to terrify people by the science, to get them worked up about the injustice, because the global injustices are, I mean, they were pretty glaring. I remember it was quite a long time ago when it was becoming clear that the effects of global warming were hitting the poorer countries, the developing countries, harder than the richer ones. And that's becoming more and more obvious. And of course, they contributed almost nothing to the problem, to the situation we're in. And I think it's a disgrace that the richer countries who've got us into this mess are still dragging their feet, having said, "Oh, we'll try to help you," the poorer countries. But that is a massive. I mean, the injustice, and I'm not one for moral outrage or to sort of. I think it's helpful, especially if we're going to talk cross-culturally, to try to keep the ethical discourse to the minimum of justice and fairness and the golden rule, putting yourself in the other person's position, trying to see it from the other person's point of view, that if we keep to that, a very basic notion of justice and fairness, on the societal level, even in the rich societies, the injustices are glaring. And then when you move to the global level between countries, it's lamentable. And so the 99.9% of the people who aren't in charge, we need somehow, I think, and social movements, with the Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, and so on. I mean, these are all very encouraging developments in the last few years, but it needs to go beyond taking to the streets. I mean, maybe it needs to do that in larger numbers, but also do something more, because so far, people took to the streets, young people especially, globally at the end of 2019, and it doesn't make any difference. The politicians go, "Oh, yeah, we get the idea," but it doesn't affect them. So we've got to figure out ways to redress some of these injustices that do affect the people who are in power, and make sure that they're not returned to power, that anyone taking money from the fossil fuel industries should definitely not be re-elected. And I can think of worse fates that should befall them. Yeah, so sorry, I at the end of that book, I was getting a bit tired, and I can't remember everything I suggested, but there are, I mean, there's lots of great ideas out there, and but I think that the more of a focus on injustice, and people say, just one last thing, I don't know enough about it to say anything very intelligent, but the Earth system science, I think in the last 20 years, we've understood so much more how things work through Earth system science. And there are many, many bright people telling us horrendous things about how close we are to certain tipping points and so on. Can something not happen societally, with social systems theory or something? People are beginning to think that there would be ways to take systems theory and say, okay, some energy here, a bit of pressure at this point in this system could lead to positive feedbacks that would carry over into other systems and that would reinforce good things happening and so on. And that's something I'm keen to explore, because it seems to me potentially valuable, because people say you just need to get a certain proportion of the world's population behind a movement and it can succeed. And that's certainly what we need.
No, that sounds fascinating. So yeah, that's definitely something to look into, and also definitely I'll link the book for everyone to really look at it. Of course, if you want to get all the details, they can read your book. But Graham, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I really appreciate you talking to me, and yeah, thank you so much for this important conversation.
Well, thank you. I think that those questions were wonderful and raised important issues, and it's been a pleasure for me to talk to you. So my thanks to you.